Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. Coming up next on the Assembling Inclusion podcast.
It just reinforced over and over again that if you design with the students who have challenges in mind, you'll catch everybody.
In addition to that, we often see students being the consumers of technology, but not creators of technology. And it's just as important for students who have learning challenges to understand what that process is, perhaps even more important.
Today on the show, we're talking to Susie Blackstein-Adler and Christy McDonald. We're talking about their debug'd coding curriculum, which is curricular materials and content to help make coding and computer science more inclusive for all learners. Inclusivity within STEM is something that I'm really excited and passionate about, so I was thrilled to be able to talk to Christy and Susie about the amazing work they've been doing. They created curricular guides and materials for educators so that coding becomes possible for everyone, not just a handful of specific students. This is a really exciting conversation, and I'm so happy to be able to share it with all of you today. So let's dive right into the episode. Hello, and welcome to the Assembly Inclusion podcast. I'm here today with Susie Blackstein-Adler and Christy McDonald, who are here to tell us about the Debug'd Curriculum Initiative for Inclusive Coding. So Susie and Christy, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
So just to start off, can you explain what the Debug'd Coding Curriculum is for our listeners?
Debug'd coding curriculum is a UDL approach to instruction and materials that ensures that all students are able to be included in coding experiences. It's been developed for Cubeto, Bluebot, Kubelets, and Dash and Dot, and we're currently working on a generic resource pack with some of those materials because we recognize that children who are younger may not be involved in formal coding, that it requires all of the structured lessons, and also that we only covered 4 robots, and there are a lot more robots that are being used in classrooms today.
So how did this initiative get started? You had mentioned there was a grant, but was there a specific inspiration behind wanting to create this kind of inclusive coding curriculum materials?
One of the big reasons actually was we were starting to notice that coding was being taught in schools. In some areas, it was part of the curriculum a few years ago. It's part of more curricula now, but a few years ago, it was showing up in classrooms. People were getting really excited about coding, but we noticed that students with complex needs were either being included in a very limited, superficial way, or they were being excluded completely. And that never sits right with us at Bridges. We're all about all kids. And so we set out to explore ways in which we could include all kids. And we approached our friends at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University because they too are all about inclusion, and got to work writing a grant proposal and received the grant. And so we were able to get our work underway.
That's really great. On my end, I'm in New Jersey, and I know that coding is becoming a more mandated part of the curriculum now. So when I had seen your program, I really was drawn to it because I thought immediately about some of my students who would maybe not be able to do certain things, but I didn't want them to miss out on that opportunity. I love the whole mission behind it and that you wanted to make it more inclusive for everyone. So one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at your curriculum online was that there's the phrases learning to code and coding to learn, and they're kind of used frequently throughout the resources. So I wanted to know, what is the difference between those two phrases, and how did you really exemplify those phrases in your program?
Learning to code are the coding skills that people usually think about. They're the foundational skills that if you're going to pursue coding in an academic manner, you need how to build a sequence of code, how to debug a sequence, what a conditional is, all of those skills. The coding to learn skills, on the other hand, are the soft skills. So those are the things that we might not think about often when we think about coding. So they're things like communication, the collaboration skills that are fostered because one robot is usually shared by a number of students. In addition to that, the persistence in problem solving. Students are really encouraged and do persist in that problem-solving pursuit. And all of those skills, we believe, are as important or more important for students who have learning challenges, because they're the ones who need to problem solve on a daily basis. Students who need augmentative communication are the ones who need to direct someone to understand how to get something done for them in the way that they prefer to have it done. And if it's not communicated in a clear manner, then it's not going to be successful. And what better way to practice than by directing a robot? Those are the soft skills. And then those coding to learn skills are also the cross-curricular connections. One of our robot kits is based around a landmarks map with landmarks from different areas of the world. Students learn about grids. They learn about moving within a grid, about coordinates, about what a landmark is. And there are landmarks from all over the world which have all of these great connections in terms of learning. So that's just one example.
I was just going to add that some of the students that we work with often have problems regulating themselves. They often have difficulty working with a peer, and we often see them working one-on-one with adults. And what we have witnessed firsthand is that with the right support, so things like visuals to support self-regulation and pre-teaching some of the expectations around how we share and how we take turns through the use of a social story, for example, we've seen students moving from working with their EA individually, being able to work with a peer. And for the teacher, that's been kind of, wow, they didn't know that that student was capable of interacting and participating in that way, which, I mean, that's so important. Those kinds of skills on top of the coding, like, are so exciting to see develop.
In addition to that, we often see students being the consumers of technology, but not creators of technology. And it's just as important for students who have learning challenges to understand what that process is, perhaps even more important. And so that was another area that we were really focused on.
I really appreciate the emphasis that you both placed on those external skills that are really more than just, like you had mentioned, the logistics of the coding, which obviously is important. But I love that there's an emphasis on the collaboration piece and the fact that students are learning to work with their peers. That's huge. And that really helps with the inclusive mindset. So that's really great that there's such a heavy emphasis on that. So just to dive into the kits themselves, I'm going to touch on the curriculum and the lessons in a little bit, but what are the typical components that you would get with a debug'd kit if you're going to use it in your classroom?
So when you purchase a debug'd coding kit, you receive a curriculum guide, which contains all of the detailed lessons, as well as a lot of background information. We help teachers understand why lessons have been developed the way they've been developed, with a very specific format, a predictable format, additional ideas for ensuring that all students are actively engaged in coding. There's a whole host of supports in that curricular guide. So that's a printed book. And then there are also some printed materials, planning materials, activity cards, left-right bracelets to support students who need reminders about left and right. So there's some physical printed materials. And then they also receive access to digital content. And that's where they'll find copies of all of the activities that they've received in printed format, but also digital slides that guide every single lesson, so they can access those. We provide activities in a variety of formats so that students who require more or less support or may require an activity that allows them to use alternative access. So all of that is in the digital content. And then sometimes they may need to purchase the robots, but in some cases they already have the robots. So they may just choose to purchase the debug'd kit separate from the robots. But it's a curriculum guide, printed materials, and digital materials.
We have created a set of cubelets that uses the Curiosity set plus 4 other cubelets that we felt were really important for making the kit, allowing us to scaffold in the way that we wanted to, as well as enabling students who are blind, for example, to be able to appreciate what was going on in a lesson. So we took a look at those factors and added 4 cubelets to that Curiosity set.
I like the wide variety in the materials that are present. Obviously, the physical and the digital and the different varieties of the lessons is great. And the supportive materials, you could really tailor to what your students need. Can you explain what the process was for actually designing the curriculum? You had said that UDL was the foundation, but how were the lessons designed?
First of all, we planned for students on the edges, because we know that if we do that we have a better chance of supporting all students. When we say all, we really do mean all. So that's where we started. We made sure that the lessons were scaffolded in a way that supports both teachers and students. So we have heard from teachers that the predictable nature of the lessons, where we actually point out for teachers what to say and what to do, is very supportive to those who have never done coding before and are petrified to launch into this new area that they hear is really fun. So we wanted to support teachers, but also students. And so the idea that every kit has the same structure in the lessons and every lesson within each kit follows the same structure really helps teachers and students to get into that flow. Beyond that, when we're looking at UDL and we're looking at principles of engagement, we looked at supporting teachers in their planning. For example, there's a social story that goes with every kit that's been very supportive in helping students to understand what they're going to be involved in and to decrease that anxiety and make them feel more comfortable. We have provided materials for students who are augmentative communication users, just in case they don't have their own communication device that has the vocabulary in it. Those are just some examples. As far as multiple means of representation, as Christy mentioned, there are materials in a variety of formats, but we've also been very deliberate about not assuming anything. So we have built foundational lessons. For example, it doesn't start out with building a sequence. It starts out with what is a robot? And for those robots where you need to use directional commands, the second lesson is about directionality and using that language. And we found that that is extremely important. Students who had been involved in doing coding with some on-screen applications were not able to direct another person using directional language to move from one place in a room to another. In every lesson, when we start a new concept, we anchor that in experience or knowledge that a student may have before, but we don't assume that they've even had that experience, and then ensure that we provide resources so that if necessary, they can build that background knowledge before launching into the new skills. So we have provided materials that students can manipulate, and that may be with their hands or it may be with alternate access, as Christy mentioned, that they're using to think and to plan with. We've created materials that use widget symbol support to new concept development. So our vocabulary cards sometimes are represented by materials that you would recognize because of the robot, but also the concept with a widget symbol, which helps to explain the concept, just as an example. And then, of course, as Christy mentioned, we wanted to make sure that students were as independent as possible and that they were going to be the ones doing the work. And so we've created materials that are printed that students can manipulate. We've made sure that those materials that are going to be manipulated a lot by students who may not have fine motor skills are laminated or cardstock. We've also made sure that we have digital materials, sometimes in PowerPoint, sometimes using Clicker, which is a popular piece of software for students who need alternate access. And then our software interface that was developed by the Ontario College of Art and Design is actually part of the lessons for BlueBot. The physical map that we created for that kit is a background that you can bring up in the software interface. So a lot of that is integrated to make sure that all students really can participate, and that we looked at those 3 principles of UDL.
The other thing I just want to add, in addition to thinking about those principles that Susie just mentioned, we were also really conscious of the fact that some of the learners who would be interacting with these materials, with these beginning coding concepts, are older learners. And so we're always conscious of creating materials that are respectful of that. And so if we're doing an activity that we viewed as maybe this would be a little bit young or feel babyish to a high school student, we created a different version. For example, in one of the lessons, we were learning about the special features of one of the cubelets. The anchor activity was comparing that to what's special about us and what's special about superheroes. The anchor activity was to create a book about what makes us special. That felt really young. And so instead, we created templates so that older students could do social media posts. So create an Instagram post where they're bragging about something that they did, or a Pinterest board where they're highlighting special skills they have, so that we're just really not wanting to insult any of our older learners. We always asked ourselves, do we need an older student version of this?
I appreciate hearing that, because I was a middle school teacher, and I know it's so hard, even with how do you make okay, let's do our vowel sounds. How do you not make that a young activity, since most of the activities are geared toward younger grades? So I appreciate the fact that when you were designing it, you really took that into consideration, because that's something that I think is so helpful for our older students, especially because you're right, a lot of them are the ones that are coding. And I really just appreciate in general how structured each of those lessons are. I know a lot of teachers are so nervous about teaching coding, especially a lot of teachers who weren't trained in that area. I downloaded one of your lessons, the free one, off of the website to see what it looked like. And that structure was just so easy to follow, and anybody could just pick that up and really bring coding to their students, which is so important.
That was the goal. So that's great to hear.
So we talked a little bit about the 4 C's of 21st century learning. You talked about the importance of collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. How do you think that those components, you discussed it a little bit, but how do you think those components really played a role within the creation of the debug'd curriculum?
As Susie mentioned right off the top, when we were observing the way some of our students with more diverse challenges were involved in coding, they often weren't the creators. We've definitely tried to include activities that allow all students to be creative, whether they are creating the code themselves or they're creating a solution to a challenge. So they have to be creative about how they solve that challenge. Sometimes they're asked to create a story to support what the robot is doing. We were working with a group of high school students who really loved that part of it, where they could write a story about Dash and tell that story as Dash was performing the program that they built for Dash. We really tried to keep it novel and really allow students to showcase some of their creativity. We've talked about the communication piece a fair amount, but Susie mentioned this, providing supports for students who may use alternate augmentative communication. But we also know that some students who may be verbal may have difficulty remembering the words they want to use or coming up with the ideas. Some of those visuals that we provide benefited other students or students who were learning English for the first time. So that aided in their communication, and not just their expressive communication, but their receptive communication as well. And then Collaboration is a huge piece of this. All of our practice and apply activities involve either working with a partner or in a small group. Rarely are they working in isolation from one another, because we know that all students need lots of opportunities to practice those skills. So that was really deliberate.
Not only was it deliberate, but we've provided resources to guide that. There are posters and reference materials to help students understand, how do I give good feedback? If we're told to agree on something before we test it and we don't agree, how can we work that out in a way that is supportive to one another? Those types of resources have been made available.
Then just finally, when we talk about the critical thinking skills that are required in coding, students are often faced with a challenge that they need to solve. And in doing that, they make mistakes, which we applaud. We celebrate mistakes because that's where the debugging comes in, and that's what coding is all about. And it's a really great lesson for students to hear. This is how we learn. Making a mistake is how we learn. We really try to normalize that right from the very first lesson. Now we need to use those critical thinking, problem-solving skills to find another way to do this. Susie mentioned some of the connections to other curriculum areas. In our Qblitz kit, we had the opportunity to really involve the scientific method, because we have the students performing some experiments to predict what they think the impact that this Qblitz is going to have on the robot, and then test it, make some observations, and then draw conclusions. They're having to use a lot of critical thinking skills through those processes.
I watched the promotional video that was on the website with the different examples of how students were using the lessons to code in the classroom. And it was nice to see them working through those processes together and building those foundational skills like communication, and even just the basic coding skills like sequencing, and then moving into the more critical thinking, debugging, technical side. It was nice to see the different examples from the classroom that were happening.
Part of that was pandemic related. Students needed their own robots, and there was more happening individually, but we still tried to, in our co-design, to get them into small groups.
Speaking of co-design, I wouldn't mind just jumping back for a second. When you talked about our process for developing the debugged curricula, a huge part of our development was using the co-design process. So all of the materials that we have developed, the lessons, the materials, the strategies, we've tested in a variety of different settings with students of all ages, from pre-K to age 20, and with different educators. And we learned so much from those experiences, where we would come back together and say, well, that didn't work. And we would go back to the drawing board and rewrite it. And some of the things were simple little tweaks we needed to make, but that made a huge difference in a classroom. For a recent example, we created planning cards for programming Bluebot so that students could lay them out and see their code, because you code Bluebot by pressing the buttons. And so after you've entered the code, you don't have a visual of what you did. And so we've created these planning cards. We do that with all of our kits because we think it's really important that students think through and plan before they test. Well, then we realized they had these planning cards at their individual desks, and then they needed to take their program to the testing station where the mat was and where the robot was, and how were they going to carry that laid out plan? So we created these planning strips, Velcro strips, where the students could attach their plan and then carry the plan. We wouldn't have thought of that if we hadn't been in the classroom and see that play out.
Then when we used the same materials with a group of students who were blind and were using embossed planning cards, we realized that it was doubly important, because it was so important for them to keep their planning cards with the braille in the right orientation as they planned and then tested.
That's great to hear that you were able to make those types of changes just from seeing what happens in a typical classroom. It's great that those modifications are being made. You mentioned that you saw this tested in many different classrooms. So how has it looked in an inclusion classroom where you may have some students who are identified with a disability working alongside their peers and their classmates. Have you seen that type of environment, and what does it typically look like?
We did co-design in a grade 1 general education classroom using Bluebot. It was a busy classroom, and that worked really well. We had 3 identified students in that classroom, but the other 16 or so students were not identified. The teacher used all of the lessons and made some modifications along the way, but all of the students participated. One of the identified students, who was working with an EA on a regular basis, not participating with peers at all, and had frequent meltdowns, started teaching his peers about what the next step was, and was so proud of himself. And it was really nice to see that type of thing. So that was a grade 1 classroom, and that was with Bluebot. We did co-design in a grade 2 classroom with Dash and Dot, and that worked really well. There were a number of students who were identified. One of the students did not speak at all at school. She only spoke at home, and started speaking during those coding lessons. There was another little fellow who never put up his hand, would never read in class, and because of the widget symbols that helped, he wasn't really reading, but it helped him to remember what had been spoken about on those posters, was much more confident and willing to participate in discussion. We did some co-design with students who were blind and who had low vision, and students who were switch users, but that was all done remotely. And then we did some co-design, as I just mentioned, with 3 grade 5 students who were blind with their teachers for the visually impaired. That was using Bluebot. The reason for that is that these students are included in general education classrooms, but their TVIs wanted to see how we could use these materials that are generally used in a general ed classroom with these students, and how they could follow along. And then, as Christy mentioned, we were in high school in self-contained classrooms with students doing Dash and Dot and Cubelets. And those students actually blew us away when they did Cubelets. We were so inspired by what they did and what they were able to do with Cubelets that we weren't sure. We were tentative because Cubelets was hard for us to get our heads around. And they were building robots and meeting the challenges that were set. We also did some co-design in summer camps with youngsters who had social-emotional difficulties, who had autism, some older students with autism who had been involved in coding and just didn't like it because it had not been scaffolded appropriately for them, with students who had significant motor challenges. We started off our co-design with a small group of children in an after-school program, and their parents participated a little bit as well. So in a variety of different settings, so summer camp, classrooms, general ed, special ed.
It just reinforced over and over again that if you design with the students who have challenges in mind, you'll catch everybody. Those grade 2 general education classes, the teachers were frequently pointing out that the students that are not identified were also relying on those scaffolds and looking to the visuals to remind them what the next step was, or glancing at their bracelets to remember which one was right and which one was left. You know, we have a lot of students who are learning English. And so the supports for students learning English, we hadn't been thinking necessarily about that. And we caught them too. So that's the beauty of UDL.
That's a perfect example of how UDL should work and how I wish more people would do that, which is curriculum in general with content area subjects. And those examples, I just hear how everyone's benefiting. Everyone's getting what they need from the lesson. And it just sounds like they were all really positive experiences. So my last question is just, the program has done a lot so far. Are there any plans for expansion or anything new coming up in the future?
We would love another grant to continue. Coding has not stopped. The problem is that this could not have been done without the funding. We just don't have the resources and time to do it. So our big effort right now is increasing awareness about what has been done. And as I mentioned, we are looking at putting together a very small kit. We're trying to figure out what to call it. We're throwing around words like debug'd light, because there's just some resources that are more generic, from the kits that teachers could use with a robot for which we haven't designed the lessons, and also could be used for younger students who are not really as involved in structured coding, but could benefit from some of the resources that have been developed to support their learning.
I want to thank you both, Susie and Christy, for being here with me today and just telling me about the debug'd curriculum and just the benefits of inclusive coding and inclusive design overall. I really appreciate you both sharing your work with me. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us on Twitter or Instagram, or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.